Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. We've got quite a few coming through at the moment. This is the next webinar in the Productivity and Profitability webinar series being brought to you by Meat and Livestock Australia and Agrista. This series is designed to assist sheep, cattle and goat producers to increase the productivity and profitability of their businesses. This series will provide you with timely and topical technical information that is relevant to all producers in Australia. My name is Tanisha Shields and I am a consultant with Agrista, and I will be your host for tonight's webinar. This webinar, titled How to Attract and Keep Good Staff, will be presented by Mick Hay, Managing Director of Rimfire Resources. Mick and I will be discussing a range of factors that are important to agricultural businesses, including what you need to prioritise to recruit staff for retention, how to attract staff in this candidate-driven market, and how brand, reputation, and social impact can help you to become an employer of choice. Before I hand over to Mick and we get into the exciting things for tonight, first I'd like to cover off on a few housekeeping topics. Tonight's webinar is being recorded and you will receive a copy of this recording to review following the webinar. The recording will also be available on the Agrista and MLA websites. We invite you to ask questions of Mick throughout the webinar tonight, and we will address your questions at the end of our discussion. To ask a question, we need you to please go to slido.com and enter the code 7705242 or scan the QR code on your screen to ask a question and jump into the Slido. I'll just give you a couple of seconds to grab that QR code or to grab the code for the Slido, and then I'll introduce Mick. Tonight's speaker is Mick Hay. Mick was originally from North Queensland and he spent more than 12 years in corporate agribusiness, working in a senior management positions across sales and supply chain, living in Moree, Adelaide, Dalby and Toowoomba. Mick recognised the need for a specialist recruiter to answer the unique needs of both agribusiness companies and candidates, and in 1998 his recruitment career began. And he established Rimfire Resources in 2001. Mick has a strong background in agribusiness, which has included working for major Australian companies operating across different market segments and regions in Australia. He has worked and conducted high-level search assignments in both an executive and non-executive capacity across most segments of agribusiness in Australia, with both a domestic and international focus. Thanks, Mick, and it's great to have you on board tonight. We'll kick it off with our first question for discussion. So very excited to be sitting here tonight having a discussion with you. And I thought that we'd preface tonight's discussion with what are the critical things happening in the employment market? And how can individuals address some of these in their businesses?
Thanks, Tanisha, and good evening, everyone. And I suppose, firstly, thanks very much to MLA and Agrista for the opportunity to be here tonight. A topic pretty dear to my heart. I suppose, look, just kicking off, look, there's no silver bullet around this topic. You need to work really hard at this, but sort of to set the scene, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what's happening out there at the moment. And further to that, ag's not unique. All sectors at the moment are really struggling. So this is not something that's unique to agriculture by any means. So we're sort of operating in an unemployment rate at the moment about 3.6%, which is pretty much sort of 50-year lows. It's certainly, I can't remember in my lifetime an unemployment rate at that. And I think in the last budget, the predictions for the unemployment rate weren't tipped to go above about, maybe 4.5% for the next 4 to 5 years. So unfortunately, this is sort of going to be a bit of a long haul. If we overlap that specifically in the agri space, we've had 3+ years of broadly very good conditions. So demand for people has been very high. We came off a pretty hard drought prior to COVID. We had COVID on top of that, which meant certainly the labour end of the market, that drained away with people exiting Australia, and that's taken a long time to start to trickle back. So that's sort of setting the scene a little bit. On top of that, we've got a really technologically savvy workforce. Jobs are really easy to find online. People's skill sets are really transferable now. People are mobile, and a really critical piece here that employers are really transparent. People can find out what it's like to work for individuals. There's a lot of information out there. So if people are really poor employers and have a reputation for such, they'll get found out. Workforce skill sets are changing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. There's a lot more ag tech, a lot more focus on business management, people leadership, finance, accountability. There's a really big need to look and embrace diversity, both locally and offshore. That's a really critical piece. I think, Australia, if we look at Australia geographically, we're sort of a pretty isolated island. Immigration's difficult, so we have a population that's here, and it's not simple just to go and find more labour. And employees, especially the younger generation, and we'll talk a bit more about that, want to work for employers of choice. They want to work for good people that represent something, companies that do good things, have a good reputation, and as Tanisha sort of touched on, have a good social impact. That's actually really quite important. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Mick. And that leads right in, like you mentioned, to our next question on what are some of those key skills in the current workforce, and how have these changed over time? Are you seeing any differences with the current workforce?
Yeah, thanks. Look, I think ag tech's the big one at the moment that's really coming into ag. Excuse me, and that's a really interesting one, because a lot of the people that are bringing ag tech to agriculture aren't agricultural people. So we've got this really interesting sort of segue at the moment where we've got a lot of ag tech companies trying to sort of deal with agriculture, and that overlap's a really interesting place at the moment. And I think there's more and more people, a lot more younger people getting a lot more sort of developed and trained up on tech, and bringing that back into agriculture, which I think is fantastic. Certainly on the on-farm piece, the biggest change I've seen, I suppose, has been driven around the whole corporatisation piece in the farming sector. And with that has come a lot more focus on business management, reporting, financial reporting, a lot more discipline, a lot more focus on people leadership and development, and that financial accountability back up to whether that be offshore investors or private equity or whatever it may be. I think that's really been a very significant change on farm.
Thanks, Mick. And you've seen those changes occur. How have you seen producers adjusting to that on farm?
Well, we've always very much tried to get people to sort of employ from the graduate base, and we'll talk a bit more about culture later. But employing in and being able to sort of shape some sort of culture with your employees, I think, is a really good way to do that. And also, I suppose a lot of the younger generation are a lot more open, certainly around the tech side, tech savvy. Certainly a lot of training and development can be put into sort of people that haven't necessarily had some of those skill sets. There's lots of examples of people that have moved into those other roles and upskilled into that, a lot more of that financial reporting. There's a lot more training out there in the market at the moment that has helped people to sort of adapt to that.
Thanks, Mick. And that leads into our next question. So as an employer, what makes you stand out to these employees? So what brand, reputation, or social impact can you have that makes you stand out to the current employee market?
Yeah, as I said earlier, employees, certainly want to work for good employers. They want to work for good brands. Now, not everybody can have a specific brand, but they also want to work for good people and companies that do good things, treat them well, or have a good reputation, and ideally, in a lot of cases, a good social impact. So it doesn't matter whether it's a farm, a rural business. There's still a lot of reputation attached to an individual entity and to the people running those entities. And I think that's a really critical piece. And we all know businesses that, people talk about as standing out for all the things that I've just mentioned. I touched on before, news travels really fast in this age, and employees know businesses with poor reputations. It's interesting in the backpacker sort of market, the poor employees literally get put up on job boards in backpacker hostels, and backpackers literally move from place to place and avoid. It's word of mouth. It even gets back overseas, the people that are coming into the country. It's quite amazing. I think it's really critical to have a brand or a reputation that stands for something. This social impact piece is really growing very strongly, and the younger generation certainly want to work for businesses that do have that positive social impact and are doing things well. And I think in agriculture we've got a fantastic opportunity to really shine in that area. So the question for me is, what makes your farm and or business different and unique? Every business has something unique or something different. That's the reason why you're there, you're farming, you're running a business, whatever it is, there's a uniqueness about that. So how can you sort of capture that and put that into an offering that makes your operation really attractive to employees?
When you're talking about social impact, Mick, what are you referring to there?
Well, I suppose that it could be a number of things. It could be this whole resource management piece that's just becoming so prevalent at the moment. It could be the condition that or what you're farming, how you're farming, your cultural practices, how that's seen. There's a whole range of things, but I suppose it's more what it's not, that you're not seen to be leaving, as we all say, we're custodians of land for the future, for future generations. I suppose it's not leaving it in a much poorer condition than you found it.
Yes, definitely. So really we're saying is you need to stand out by making sure that you have a good reputation, work out how you can communicate your brand, and do understand what that positive social impact is for your business.
Yeah, and look, that some of that sounds really difficult, but I think back to the uniqueness of why everybody's doing what they're doing on their individual place. Everybody thinks they're doing the right thing. So how do you actually package that up and effectively, sell it, if you like, to a prospective employee? I mean, that's what you're doing in a job interview. It's very much a two-way street now. An interview is not one way. So I think that's the, a good interview is conducted that way, and people will challenge you on what are you doing on your particular farm? What does that look like? What does the future look like? Yeah.
Definitely. And that leads in very well to our next question on the selling piece, is how important is remuneration? What are non-financial incentives, and how might an employer communicate these to their employees?
Yeah, interesting one. So the financial remuneration piece obviously goes a long way towards retention, but pay should be aligned to the value of the work performed. I think the financial piece has really risen to the top in the last three or 4 years. A lot of that's driven by demand, but I've found over 25 years that financial remunerations in most cases not the most important thing, but it bubbles to the top really quickly if there are other things at play. So they'll use, quite often employees will use finance or REM as the number one issue, but quite often sitting behind that, there's another issue. While REM's really critical, it's not the only thing. There's, there are plenty of other things as far as other non-financial incentives. Look, there's a whole range of things. It could be flexibility in the workplace. Now, obviously on farm, that's a little bit more difficult, but I certainly know from examples recently that, people are being more flexible about where they're allowing people to live. Maybe there's a partner in the that wants to work and has the ability, if they live in a different town, but it can still work. There's those sorts of things. There's extra leave. There's things like private health cover. If you're in town, it might be gym membership. It might be training and development, private use of vehicle, housing. I think the critical thing for me is it doesn't matter what they are. I think that they need to be actually communicated and actually spelt out as part of an overall package so that people actually understand the value. And a good example of that is certainly and look, it's in many places in Australia, but certainly prevalent in Northern Australia in really isolated situations or stations, things like private school fees. So quite often people in the north might appear to be not necessarily on a large salary, but if that package is actually put together and put a monetary value around it, it can be 2-3 times what the actual base is, or sometimes more. And I think it's really important that that's spelt out, including, whether there might be a bonus structure or some sort of profit share or whatever it is. I think it's really important that employees understand the true value, to them as a package. And the other takeaway there is what's important to one person, won't necessarily be important to another. So, even a profit share or whatever it might be, that may have absolutely no interest to somebody, but an extra week's leave because they live in an isolated area, or whatever it is, that might be really critical. So I think it's not a one shoe fits all. It's really understanding what's critical to an individual.
In a recruitment process, Mick, how would someone go about understanding what is critical to that individual?
Well, I think asking them is a pretty good place to start, but it's, I think, as I said before, a really good interview, the worst interview process is when a candidate goes into a job interview and they're spoken at for 40 minutes and they come out and they've hardly got a word in. And that still happens a lot. A really good interview is where it's a really good two-way discussion and conversation, and both sides openly, even challenging each other on different things. And I think the more openness that can be in that type of environment, the better value it will be for both sides. And I don't think it's an unfair question at all to really sort of ask. A lot of on-farm interviewing, I'm assuming, certainly when we do that, you're interviewing quite often a couple or someone and a partner, or it's not an individual, it's a sort of a package deal. So what is it that's important to them? What do they like doing outside of work? If they're going to be really isolated, what's going to take their time up in has the partner got a hobby, or whether it be an online business or whatever it is, what is it that's going to keep them there and motivated and engaged in that role?
Excellent. And so really understanding and being able to then communicate that value of those non-financial incentives to prospective employee or even the current employee as well. And
look, I mean, sometimes through that process as well, you may just find that it's not going to work. You may not be able to provide what somebody is looking for, and it's a whole lot better to find that out then than it is 3 months or 4 months into basically an employment relationship.
Definitely better to ask the question up front and understand. Really leads into how we can then go on and build good relationships and trusts with our employees once they're working with us.
Yeah, and I suppose that's just an extension of what we've sort of talked about. I think it's investing the time in your employees and really taking interest in them personally. You don't have to be best friends. That's not what I'm saying. You don't have to have them in your house 3 times a week, but invest in them personally. Really understand what's sort of important to them and or their family. What makes them tick. It's no different from somebody talking to you about that. And if you're looking at, as we said, looking at providing non-financial incentives, do you know what they really value? So why give somebody I don't know, gym membership if they've got no intention of going near a gym? So I think you've got to understand what motivates and drives people, and especially from a farming perspective, what do they do to sort of unwind? What do they do to in that downtime? Or yeah. And if there's none of that, I suppose the other thing is too, are you fairly remunerating them? And we'll talk a little bit about that later. As I said earlier too, that remuneration, I really believe, is very rarely the number one issue, but it'll appear to be the number one issue because there's something else behind it. And if you're not fairly remunerating, and I'm not saying remunerating at the top, I'm talking about fairly remunerating, it can often build, or quite often build, mistrust.
Definitely, that's so important, Mick, and that really leads into, we've gone through remuneration and talking about building relationships and trust with employees, but do you see that there are any good systems and processes that employers use to retain employees once they've got them there?
But one of the big ones is training and development. People like to sort of move forward. Not everyone wants to own a farm. Not everyone wants to be the general manager of a big corporate. But I don't think there's anybody that doesn't want to actually have some sort of training and development and feel like that they're developing in some way, whatever the level is. So I think training and development's a big one. People generally like structure and they like understanding where a business is heading. And I think agriculture, sometimes we're not prepared to share too much with our employees. And I think the more preparedness you are to share your vision with your employees, and I'm not talking about necessarily telling them, the bottom line on the P&L, but talk to them about where you're going, what it looks like, how can you get them involved in that so they actually feel a piece of ownership around that. Back to that, do you know what's sort of important to them? Have them actually really invested in the business so they genuinely feel a part of it. And, can you implement some sort of a structured pay scheme that's linked to the farm or business profitability, and then be able to really clearly communicate that? Again, it's back to that sort of invested and having buy-in. Now, obviously, you're not going to do that with new employees. You're not going to do that with people that you don't feel are going to be the part of the future of the business. But I think if you have good people, then it's just absolutely critical that you keep them and you nurture them, and have them feeling like they're part of the deal.
And that really leads into the question I was going to ask next, Mick, is, so what are the benefits of attracting and retaining good staff for employers? It seems that there's a fair bit involved here, that we're talking about sharing our visions and having structures, understanding pay and what's fair. So what are the benefits for an employer for doing all of this work?
Well, I think there's 3 or 4 that sort of stand out probably for me. Look, higher retention rates, clearly that is less stressful for people running a business, whether it's a farm or any other business. We've all been there when you lose good staff, and it's stressful. And then the need to continually look for retrain, or look for, find, retrain, and hopefully retain new staff, and the cost that goes with that. And we all, at the moment, we know that this is a really, really, really difficult market. It's really tough. And if you're not looking after people, someone else will take them and look after them. I think more capable employees become more valuable over time. It's obviously goes with reason that somebody that's been there 3 or 4 years is going to add a lot more value in your business than somebody that hasn't. And I think generally that would roll into a lot more higher likelihood of higher profitability for the business, obviously, seasonally dependent. But I think one of the big ones, and I'm not talking so much about the corporates here, but I will talk about the corporates with this, but first I'll talk about more farm or small business owners. It's the ability to be able to step away or step back from the business and focus on either the strategic functions of the operation, and or just be able to get away and have some time and know that the operation's in good hands. And I think if I go back to the corporates, and okay, they've got bigger structures and quite often more money with the ability to do it, but that's what structure brings. And there are the structures that let people actually do that. But I think that's a big one for small business or small family farming operations. It's the ability to have great, good trusted staff, and trust's a really big word in all of this that we probably haven't used yet. But trust is a really big part of this. But it does allow you to step away or let you to step back and focus on the strategic sort of stuff that you probably all want to do or like doing, but don't get enough time to do. And that's me included.
Definitely. It's so valuable, especially as you mentioned, Mick, in the current market with how difficult it is. You're not looking after them, someone else will. So I think that's a really good point to hammer home there. And I think that really leads into the key thing we wanted to cover off on tonight is how can we improve our culture and attractiveness to be an employer of choice, and what even is culture when you're talking about that so importantly throughout tonight's conversation.
Yeah. I sort of wanted to harp on this a little bit because for me, I think culture's overlooked a lot by a lot of people, but I certainly believe it's probably the single biggest issue around workplace retention. Culture is a critical part of any business, and the better the culture, the better the retention. So, what is it? Everyone says, well, what is culture? I sort of that's a classic textbook answer. For me, it's sort of walking in the door of a business or walking on farm, and you just immediately get a feeling of what it looks like. If you walk into an office, how are the staff in there? How are they engaging with you? Are they happy? Are they all, what does it look like? And it can become quite obvious quite quickly. Culture often starts from the top, so you can have an organisation that'll completely change culture with a new CEO or a new owner, which is an interesting sort of piece. Why is it important? Just on workplace culture, somebody did say to me the other day, they said for them, workplace culture was how they felt on a Sunday night thinking about what Monday morning was going to look like going to work. And I thought that was a really interesting way to think about it as well. But why is it important? I think there's absolutely no doubt the businesses that have got great culture are just they're absolutely magnets for talent. It drives engagement. People are happy, satisfied, and there's absolutely no doubt it affects performance. So, those 4 things there for me, if you've got a business or a farm with great culture, then, those 4 things alone are a huge sort of help to attract and retain talent. So what sort of affects it? Pretty much everything. So sort of leadership, mentioned that before, whether that's a new owner, a new manager, workplace practices. Sometimes culture can be affected by paralysis by too many systems and processes that aren't practical, policies. The people in the business, it can have a misaligned, mission, vision, or the work. Amazingly, a really poor office environment or a really bad work environment can really drive down culture. People don't want to be there. It's not a place they want to go to, and it just drags the whole place down. And communications again. So how engaged are people? So there's an old saying that people leave people and or managers and not companies, and I think that's really, really true. I think a lot of people, and it's amazing how often people won't move on when companies know that they've got a problem with a manager and people are leaving, and they keep trying to fix the problem, and by the time they fix the problem, they've lost all the talent. And it's really, it happens so often. And this is also something that I absolutely think is really very true, that, many people leave jobs not because there's a compelling reason to leave, but they've actually just got no real reason to stay. So I think if you think about that and think about, well, what can we do? What can we provide that can give someone a reason to want to stay and want to be part of what we're sort of trying to do and trying to build. So I think, if you can give some thought to what can your farm or business provide, I think that's a really good place to start.
How, Mick, would we know if you're an employer and you wish to assess what your culture is, or it's the first time you've ever heard the word workplace culture? Where might you start to see where you stand?
I'd look at, there's probably some good indicators. Maybe staff turnover is probably a pretty good place to start. I'm not sure how many people try and talk to their staff if they're leaving, why are they leaving, exit interviewing. I think if you're having regular discussions with people and it's a really open and transparent discussion, people will talk to you about that. Are your staff happy? Are they engaged? All those things that we've talked about, I think, are sort of triggers for that. I think also have a look at those businesses that we all know about that are able to attract people and are just seen as really good places to work. What do they look like, from the outside? Looking in, what are the things that you see that you could emulate where in your own operation?
That's a really good point, is looking over the fence and seeing what someone else is doing. So if we want to work on this in our business, what should we do next if you're an employer?
Sorry, I'll just go back one step. So I'll give you a good example of, I walked into a business recently and we walked into the kitchen and all the employees, I was asked if I'd like a cup of coffee, and I looked up and I went to get a coffee cup out of the cupboard, and every cup had a name on it. And then I opened the fridge and there was about 5 different bottles of milk and everyone's had a name on it. And everyone I met was just in this terrible, sort of dreary, awful place to be. And it was like everyone was just fighting for themselves. There was no spirit, there was no, and that to me just was the epitome of a place that people probably on that Sunday night thought, oh, really, I've got to go there again on Monday. And that for me was a great example of a place that just had really poor workplace culture. And, the extension of that is how could they be getting good productivity out of those people?
Yeah,
Sorry, I jumped in there.
That's okay. That's the next steps for someone. So that we've sat here and you've given us some really good tips on what's important to look out for in your own workplace. So if you wish to work on this in your business, what should we do next?
As I said, maybe put yourselves in an employee's shoes. Think about what you offer, and would you find it appealing if you were looking for a job? So put yourself on the outside. Why would I come and work with you? What does that look like? Why would I work for you rather than, somebody else that's offering? Forget about the dollars, but what else? What are the other things that are? You're looking at diversity in technology when recruiting staff. I think that's really important. So look outside the square. When looking outside the square, for example, you're prepared to recruit somebody with a great cultural fit, but less specific skill set. So, hire for attitude, train for skill. Personally, I mean, obviously there are certain jobs that people need a certain set of skill sets for. There's obviously no doubt about that, but there's also a huge opportunity for hiring for attitude and training and developing for skill. How can we improve our culture and attractiveness to be an employer of choice? So how are you able to do that? And I think spend some time understanding generational differences. I think that's really important as well, how they think and approach work. So I was just doing a little bit of having a look at this. So, we've all heard the term Gen Z or Gen Z. So they're sort of 12 or 13 to 27-year-olds. So they're either in the workforce or they're about to be. So what do they look at? They look at prioritising health and well-being over work. So they'd rather have a balance. They list positive culture, mental health and well-being benefits, sense of purpose, meaning is their top 3 priorities. So every time they go for an interview, and it doesn't matter where it is, at the back of their mind, they're going to be thinking about other things apart from, just what's on offer with the role. Tenure is not what it was. And I don't think that's a bad thing. We still get people ringing us saying, I want someone for the next 15 years. Well, I'd way prefer in my business to have somebody for 2 or 3 years that's really engaged, heaps of energy, than somebody that's been there for 10 that's giving me nothing. So I think, that tenure piece is and a lot of people put that back to loyalty, and I'm not so sure about that. I think, maybe there is less loyalty, yeah, but I think there's almost a bit of an agreement that if I've been paid now, then we start again next week. We're both done our bit. You've paid me, and I've done the work. So, and that's just a change. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think, but it needs to be embraced. You can't fight it. It's just how it is.
I think that's really important, Mick, is just understanding the demographics of the workforce and what their expectations might be. And like you said, looking over the fence and seeing that neighbouring farm or business that has that excellent reputation and doesn't seem to have issues with their staff. So what do they do?
Yeah. And look, just something to think about. As I've said it a few times tonight, I really don't personally believe that Rem is absolutely on top. It's really important. So when I say fairly, it's got to be fairly. It doesn't have to be absolutely on top. But I genuinely don't believe this has changed for 20 plus years. People want to work for good people. That's that piece around give me a compelling reason, or people leave people, not companies. They want to do interesting work. They want to be developed. They want to get trained. They want to do things. And I don't think it matters at what level that is. They want to be remunerated fairly, and they want to be treated fairly. And I think those sort of 5 things are really critical.
I think that's excellent points, Mick, and a really great way to wrap up the structured part of our conversation tonight. And I think it's awesome that you say that it doesn't really matter who or at what level, everyone wants to be treated fairly, and that keenness to develop new skills. I see that quite often is there's such an interest in training and development that we see from the workforce at the moment. Just a reminder to the audience, we will now take questions from you all. And in order to ask a question of Mick, just jump over to slido.com, enter the code 7705242, or scan the QR code on the screen and you'll be able to type in your questions there. We've had some come through already, Mick, so we'll get rolling with the audience questions. The first one we've got here is, how can extension organisations support local ag businesses and farms in recruitment and retention of staff? What role can they play?
Sorry, what was the first bit? What extension?
Extension organisations.
Okay. How can they support
Ag businesses and farms in this recruitment space?
Yep. So when you talk about extension, are we talking either potentially to the department or grower organisations, those sorts of? Okay.
Yes.
Well, I think there's actually quite a big role there to play by, they could certainly be bringing in graduates and giving graduates exposure to a whole lot of new skills that then might be able to be taken up by local farms. I think just a quick note on graduates. At the moment, we've seen a big shift in the last probably 10 years where we've got lots and lots of graduates coming out, but there's a big gap in their knowledge of agriculture. So the big upshift came sort of in about after 2010, but it was predominantly by people that weren't brought up on farms. So which I think is fantastic from a diversity point of view, but it also means that everybody, you can't expect graduates, all of them, to come out and know everything. So people have got to do a bit of sort of heavy lifting around that exposure and developing them to agriculture. So I think that's certainly an opportunity for extension organisations to be able to help with that. Maybe there's some training things that those extension organisations that could be doing on farm or with farmers to help them actually, whether that be skills around recruitment or some of the stuff we've talked about tonight.
How would you go about, as an employer, and you're looking at employing a new graduate that may not have that experience, how do you gauge whether it's a good hire? And it would often be, I could imagine, quite a tricky step for an employer to bring someone in with that limited background.
Yeah, that's a very fair assessment and comment. Yes, it is. And I think the hard part about recruiting graduates is that quite often people will dip their toe in and it won't work, and they'll sort of say, bloody graduates, never again. I think you've got to persist, and there's so many examples of where businesses have persisted, and the ones that come through are just their most fantastic cultural ambassadors that are their stars. They won't all work. That's absolutely true. I suppose it's spending, if you think about an interview process, a lot of people make a hiring decision on a 45-minute interview. So it doesn't have to be like that. Make it over 2 or 3 interviews. Make sure it's face to face. Go and have coffee with them. Put them in a different environment. So don't make maybe one's formal and then make the next one completely not formal. Try and see them in a different frame of mind. I think with graduates, and not only graduates, it's what else do they like doing? What are they going to want to do outside of their work hours? So does the local community provide those sort of things that are going to keep them engaged, or not?
If you live in an area, Mick, where the local community may not be quite so thriving, how can you communicate that to employees and help them through this process?
As in, how can you attract them to come and work with you?
Yes.
Well, I think there's always people that will be attracted, to that type of work, but they're still going to want a life outside of what they're doing now. Whether or not that's, if I go back to the Northern Australian sort of example, those businesses that have got really good internet connectivity, that have set up some really good opportunities for whether it's, like whether it's a swimming pool, whether it's whatever it is, they've actually thought about, okay, if people are going to be working however many hours a week, then what have we got to actually look after them while they're on their downtime? I think that's really important. And again,
Definitely.
that might be the one that where a 3-day weekend every period of time is really critical to let them get away, or it might be that 5 weeks, not 4, or whatever it might be, or when harvest's on, it's full on. When it's not, they get some time off, or it's again structuring something it's understanding again what's important to them and how you can actually mold something around that.
Speaking of what's important, we've had a question come through around training and development and how, as an employer, can they justify the cost of sending staff away to training and development opportunities. That's both time off work and also often these opportunities come with a cash cost as well.
Yep, absolutely. I suppose my first comment is how could you afford not to and have someone not trained and developed staying there and not going anywhere? I suppose there's also other opportunities, whether that's online. There's lots of industry types of training. Absolutely. I take that on board. It can be costly, but I'm sure there must be a lot of different opportunities provided by, whether or not it's through RDCs or the local, what we were talking about before, the extension type organisations. Maybe that's a role for those types of organisations to be providing some of that training and development, and maybe that can be done sort of on farm with clusters of people, so they're not actually leaving or going out of the district.
So yeah, some really good ideas, Mick, is like taking the training to the employees, looking outside the square for online opportunities as well. The next question that we've had come through is there any indication of what fair remuneration is currently for on-farm roles, or where might someone go to look for that information?
Yeah. That's a really interesting and difficult question to answer, because there's just so many variables. You've got size, you've got complexity, you've got what other benefits are people getting. You've got probably got the corporates to some degree setting the pace around pay scales and conditions. So that is a really, really difficult question. I take that on board. I mean, I suppose you can talk to, I'm sure there's certainly some benchmarking. There's some groups that do benchmarking around that. We do a little bit, but there's certainly a number of other organisations that are benchmarking, whether it's productivity, but they're also picking up labour cost and farm management type labour surveys. I think, and I'm not sure, but I think the NFF does something, or maybe it's some of the farmer organisations do that. But it's not easy, because sometimes smaller farming units that have got an absentee manager can be some of the highest payers, because they're paying for somebody that they're entrusting to manage their little crown jewel while they're living in Sydney or Melbourne, rather than it's very difficult.
It's very unique to each situation, like you said, and also unique to the employee with their different expectations and values as well, with what they might want. It's not financial.
Yeah, and look, it's even some of the well, I suppose they are monetary eventually, but some of the things I've seen are people that are allowed to run some cattle, or they're allowed to they've given a small block to grow a crop. Those sorts of things are, how do you monetize that? Now, when people start to get those, you just can't move them. So they mightn't be getting that, mightn't be front and center in salary, but they're the sort of things that make them incredibly sticky. You just can't move people in those sorts of situations.
Yeah, definitely. And then another one that I think may be important, and it's come up here in a question, is how do we as farm businesses provide job security in the lead up to and during events such as drought?
Yeah. Really tough question because, as I said, the industry at the moment's loaded up. We weren't 4 years ago before COVID, coming out of drought. I think the right way to approach that is to have try and strike a good balance where you have sort of salary and then you have at-risk pay, and that at-risk pay might be related to crop output, whatever it is. It could be profit share, it could be whatever, but that's dialed up and down depending on the variability of what you're writing. At a lower level, I think there's the real option of trying to look at variable labour, whether it's contract, whether it's casual. The more you have flexibility in your fixed cost base, the better. And without predicting doom and gloom by any means, that's certainly not my intention. But if we've just come off 3 or 4, pretty solid years, there are going to be places, we've all probably been there. There's going to be places where it will get drier at some point, and we need to be preparing for that. We need to be thinking about how are we going to manage our fixed cost base, and how can we make more of that variable.
Is there anything that we can do as far as retaining those casual staff or the contract staff in our businesses different to what we've discussed tonight?
Only from a point of view, if you can find like-minded businesses in an area that don't necessarily need, if you can find a counter-cyclical business in the area that you can share labour with, that gives a casual tenure, then fantastic. It's more difficult if everybody wants them at sowing or whatever it might be. That makes it really difficult. But certainly, there's certainly a number of businesses that have looked at how they can share casual sort of labour and move them so that they actually don't lose them for that exact reason. I mean, horticulture is one that does that quite well in certain places.
Definitely, that's a great idea if you can and where possible. We've also had another question come through, Mick, in relation to how can farm businesses support the mental health of employees working in remote and rural locations?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a really critical question. I suppose firstly it's being aware of that. That's the fundamental first step. It's actually having a workforce that can recognise symptoms, and I suppose there are training and things you can do for that. I certainly, we were involved in certainly some of those through the drought. There was a lot of different pieces around that, but I think being in a position where you actually recognise the symptoms is probably the first thing, and having resources to be able to deal with that, whether or not that's somebody that they can talk to. How can we provide a line that they can talk to somebody, and I mean, that's quite obviously a specialised area, but I think the most important thing is being able to recognise symptoms.
And that really comes down to developing that relationship and trust with your employees, which is underpinning the theme of our whole conversation tonight, doesn't it, Mick?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you have that relationship, I think, not always. I mean, we always hear about, the very unexpected things that happen due to mental health. But I think, sometimes when you look back at those situations, you'll go, there was some signs, we should have recognised that. So, maybe there's more to be done around that.
Very, very important topic. I will just remind the audience we're nearing the final minutes of our webinar tonight. So if there's any last questions to sneak through, type them in. But the last one that I've got here for the moment, Mick, is around that recruitment process. So you mentioned that there would potentially you could use 2 to 3 interviews to really get to know an employee. How does a prospective employer go about doing this when they're generally under time pressure and recruitment's happening when you needed somebody yesterday?
Yep. Which is the catch-22, because if you don't actually get them, it never improves. Look, it doesn't. Yeah, it's easy to say you've got to make time. I get it. That's not easy. But it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be in traditional, hours. It can be out of hours. You can use online. But I personally think there's got to be a point at which it's got to be face to face. I think it's a really critical decision that you're making, and once you're outside sort of probation, it can be really difficult and it can be extremely costly. So I think if you think about it, if you think about the complexity of the decision you're making, I think it's worthy of absolutely trying to make time.
Definitely. Thanks, Mick. And we've had one last question come through. So I'll ask you this one just as I put the feedback survey up for the audience to fill in their feedback for the evening. But going back to the casual labour and contractors, what impact do the contractors have on the stability of permanent employment in businesses? So more young people are preferring contracting over permanent employment.
So sorry, can you just repeat that, the first part?
What impact do contractors have on the stability of permanent employment in businesses?
Yeah, interesting question. I suppose that depends on, again, the environment that they're coming into and whether or not you're just supplementing your, a broader talent base that are permanent, or whether or not the predominant workforce that you've got are casual. I certainly don't think it's much harder to build really strong culture when you've got people coming in and out and coming on and off farm. It's that permanent base that will really build that. But I certainly think that, you can have a great culture with your permanent staff and supplement that with casuals and not necessarily erode culture.
Definitely. Thank you, Mick, and thank you very much for your time tonight. I know I've certainly taken a lot away from this evening, and there's some real key take-home messages that producers can go home and implement in their businesses straight away. Just remembering that employees want to work for good people. They want to do interesting work, develop new skills, be remunerated, fairly, and want to be treated fairly. I think that's the key take-homes that I've got from this evening. And thank you very much for your time. I'd like to thank everyone in the audience who's joined us for tonight's webinar. And if you have any additional questions or suggestions for future topics, please feel free to reach out. The best way to do so is right now by filling in the survey at the QR code on the screen, or clicking, there's going to be a link in your Slido come up. So if you miss the QR code, you can click that link in the Slido, and that will just help us to guide the direction of future webinars in these series. Thanks everyone again for attending, and we look forward to you joining us for our next webinar on the 9th of August with Phil Graham, where we'll be looking at a seasonal update, like what the forecast that we've alluded to tonight means for producers and what these implications are for your business. But thank you very much again, Mick. Really enjoyed our conversation tonight.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the opportunity.